Greetings and welcome back to Room 303 and our chats with Emily as we are calling our readings through the Johnson edition, all 1,775 poems of that edition of the poems of Emily Dickinson. We turn now to a little poem, number 47, Heart, We Will Forget Him. I find this a fascinating poem for a number of reasons. There are many people who are critical of the poetry of Emily Dickinson. I just recently, it was said again to me, oh man, all of her poems are about death and dying. I mean, really, I mean, it's just so morbid. How can you pay attention to her at the level that you are? And I like to point out, well, first of all, lots and lots of Emily Dickinson's poems have nothing to do with death. As evidenced by, we're nearing poem 50. Obviously, there's been a number of poems that had nothing to do with death or dying. But secondly, I would make the argument, like a poem like this, that it's less for Emily about death, and it's far more about passing, change, transformation, and the ways in which those kinds of things happen. Now, I'm fascinated by this little poem as well because of the Platonic element of the dialogue, and so we'll have that here in a moment to focus on. The most obvious question in this poem will be, who is she actually talking about? Who is the him of the poem? She's always playing this game of the vague antecedent, as we call it, right? It's unclear who the pronouns are referencing. Now, our assumptions that you've been following our stuff at LearnStrong.net, down that left-hand side, Chats with Emily, our playlist. I'm hopeful that you have already had some time to study our intro lecture as well as the previous 46 poems we just finished with I Keep My Pledge. Now, this poem is a dialogue between the heart and the mind, between the head versus the heart is the dichotomy as sometimes understood. And it's about remembering versus forgetting, and the ways in which a certain someone, who is that? Some have argued it's maybe Sam Boyle, some have argued it's Ben Newton. She once said of Ben Newton that he was the friend who taught me immortality, this apprentice in her father's law office. Some have argued that maybe it's Reverend Charles Wadsworth, the Philadelphia clergyman, that she had a certain kind of infatuation with. We've commented on this already in previous conversations. Let's just enjoy the poem. And I want you to pay attention to not just word choice here, but to the rhythm of this poem. A number have pointed out, scholars have pointed out, that this is a rhythm that is the rhythm of anguish. Some would call it anguish or struggle, trying to put away the memory of someone one cares about. Heart, we will forget him, you and I, tonight. You may forget the warmth he gave, I will forget the light. When you have done, pray tell me, that I may straight begin. Haste, lest while you're lagging, I remember him. Now, I love the ironies of Emily's poetry. I love the fact that she seems to almost at the same time be so serious, but so joking, so capable of enjoying the play of language. The rhythms of this poem, to me, are quite remarkable. Notice we will begin with heart, and we will end with haste. So already we're playing similar games with the exclamation point to finish that single word. Of course, if the mind is speaking to the heart, that is to say, the intellect speaking to the emotions, there's a challenge because we have to forget a certain someone, in this case, him. Notice, collectively, we will, head and heart, we will forget him. Now, again, who the him is, we don't know. You and I, tonight, you may forget the warmth he gave, I will forget the light. So notice the rhyming here that will be played out. Of course, the rhythms, heart, you will forget him, you and I tonight. So, I mean, but then notice, you may forget the, and all of a sudden the rhythm is broken, which makes sense to capture the ambiguous nature of this poem. In other words, how am I going to deal with this? I'm having a conversation with myself. Now, think about the power of that. You're out in the Badlands driving at a certain time in the middle of the night. While you're there, we won't ask. And you're alone, and your car breaks down, your truck breaks down. What's the very first thing you do? Well, as we've said in our instruction on writing, we start talking to ourselves. Oh, this is just great. My mom's going to kill me. If, for example, I could appear, not to freak you out, I could appear, I say, who are you talking to? This is the human condition. When we are met with a moment of pain or suffering, the theodicy moment, as we've referred to it elsewhere, we begin finding a way to talk to ourselves through the experience. And notice that the rhythm of the poem will play that game. You've got the head, the intellect, talking. You've got the heart or the emotions, listening. Notice, heart, we will forget him. This is the rational component. You and I tonight. By the way, notice the power of the word forget being used in Emily's trinities and her threes. You may forget the warmth he gave. I will forget the light. Now, it's a good argument to say that the heart will remember the warmth and the head will remember the light. We're obviously speaking in Platonic terms. You guys, go back to what I said when we did our talks with Walt and we read all the poems of Leaves of Grass. And you'll remember that I said, I think he's having a tremendous fun time writing these poems and publishing these poems. I think Emily was having a fun time, although not publishing the poems, certainly writing the poems. And I think that there's some reason why she always wants to return to the light. That is to say, to Plato's Republic 7. We've given full lectures at learnstrong.net, the cave allegory and all of that. Notice all the exclamation points here, right? When you have done, that is to say, when the emotions are finished, pray, tell me. This use of the word pray is a fascinating word. Some have seen this maybe as the central word of the entire poem, because this poem can be read as a prayer or a request of a kind. Pray that I may straight begin. Notice the use of the word begin and then him as the rhyme. It's not quite. It's kind of a little bit off, right? The rhyme. That I may straight begin. Haste, back to heart. Haste, lest while you're lagging, in other words, if you don't follow right on, I remember him. In other words, the head says to the heart, if you don't immediately pick up with the project of forgetting him, I may struggle. So this tension between the head and the heart. Well, what really is going on in a little poem like this? I think that this is an interesting dialogue that suggests that it is hard at times to forget or to set aside a significant other, possibly a pal, possibly a lover. And in that moment, the head and the heart will constantly have this back and forth, this conversation, this discussion about how will we ever forget. Of course, note the irony. In the moments when I tell myself to forget about someone or something, obviously I'm remembering the nature of memory being what it is. At 2b, I love the what some have called the rhythm of anguish here, the struggling to somehow get rid of memory, to put it out of mind. And of course, in the process of writing a poem where one prays that one can do it, one is obviously not doing it. At 3a, I mean, there's just so many different places I could take us here for comparisons. I love to go back to St. Augustine's Confessions 4:4, and you'll remember that he talks about the death or the passing of his pal, Nebridius, and he's always asking about how do I forget Nebridius and my pal, and he's just torn apart by it. And of course, as we said at learnstrong.net when we gave lectures over Confessions, it's such a powerful moment in the history of writing, that you have this brilliant intellect trying to forget what one can never forget. And in the process of trying to forget, one only remembers more, and the pain is obviously acute. I think about, as well, Houston Smith's great book, Religions of the World, that non-apologetic study of religions, where he makes the observation that there are three important questions that religions have to come to terms with, and one of those is, which is more important, the head or the heart? I'll challenge you to run that to ground. It's a fascinating study of its own, that depending upon where you place precedence, is it the intellect or is it the emotions, that will determine in large measure kind of how you process the world. It's a fascinating idea. Certainly Emily, I think, references both sides of that. She's very much about the head. She's very much about the intellect. She's also very much about the emotions and the heart as well, that to me is what makes her such an amazing writer, that she'll dance between the two. And then finally, how are we going to own a poem like this at 3b? Well, what was a time that you struggled to forget, and through the process of struggling to forget, you were only enhancing the memory? And to that degree, how did you reconcile head versus heart, and which is more important to you? Or do they dance, as Emily will suggest? Thank you.